Okay, let's look at Standard 12, Substandard D. Describe the 1894 Pullman strike as an example of industrial unrest. So let's go ahead and look at that. Our focus here is on the Pullman strike, but the industrial unrest is our main focus. Industrial unrest. They're not rested, okay? So we see 1894 Pullman strike and industrial unrest, conflict and compromise, and political and social interactions are our themes. Alright, so what is industrial unrest? It is where workers and laborers are going to be upset or angered to the point of striking and violence. They're going to quit working and they're going to protest what they perceive to be unfair working conditions. That's what industrial unrest is. Characteristics: they're receiving low pay and they don't like it, unequal pay or long working hours or whatever it may be, something they consider and perceive to be unfair. Examples were in 1894, the Pullman strike. George Pullman's company. I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Non-examples of things that might cause industrial unrest are a minimum wage 40-hour work week, workers' compensation, OSHA, which is a safety law government regulatory agency, and then Fair Labor Standards Act and child labor laws. These are things that are coming during the Progressive era. Pullman, George Pullman, this guy here, owned this company in Pullman, Illinois, called the Pullman Palace Car Company, and he has over 3,000 workers. Community. He creates this community of Pullman in Pullman, Illinois. It's near Chicago, Illinois, and he rented these homes to these workers. And the Pullman community had company stores for workers to buy things. And let's see, here's Pullman area in Illinois here. They had homes there, schools there, churches there, parks there, and stores there. Industrial paternalism was this idea that George Pullman had, that if you give your workers all these, they'll be happy. But he didn't give it to them for free. They had to pay rent and utilities, and he made money off these stores. And the rent and utilities were higher in Pullman than there were anywhere else. But here's the Pullman community part of it, and there's Pullman buildings back here somewhere. And what the Pullman Palace Car Company is going to make is these fancy railroad cars that are going to be luxurious, where people who have a lot of money can ride in them. Here's a different picture of one. Here's what the inside looks like. Real delicate and fancy looking in here. Some were a little bit more extravagant than that. Here's one room that's called the Countess. Was one of the cars had this. You probably saw these in a few movies about the West and the railroads. I can't think of one right off, but probably Zorro maybe. But anyway, these famous palace cars. There are lots of presidents rode in these in the day. But that's what they make, is these palace car, extravagant palace cars. Let's go to Pullman, Illinois on our Google map. We see here, I have it on Google map. There's Chicago. There's Lake Michigan. Let's go close to Chicago over here, and here's the Pullman community down here below Chicago here, right here on Lake Michigan. There's Pullman community, and it has it outlined in pink here. That's where the Pullman community was located, excuse me. Alright, so they made these Pullman cars, and there's going to be a dispute because in 1893 there was an economic panic and a lot of money was lost. So George Pullman, in order to save his business, his community, he's going to cut wages by 25% from his workers. He's going to cut their wages by 25%. And but in his community, he's not going to reduce his rent or utilities or the prices of goods within his stores. He's going to keep those continuous. He's not going to lower them any. And here's a cartoon showing Pullman, George Pullman here. Low wages and high rent. Here's the worker here being strangled to death by George Pullman. This is a cartoon during the time. Here's a different one, sketch here. It says October 3rd, 1894, Pullman. Let us be thankful that Mr. Pullman's dividends have not been reduced. No affidavit necessary to deny that Mr. Pullman did not pay for this banquet, meaning what they're eating here. And here's from the relief committee. In other words, they're poor, they can't afford to eat, so they get this from the relief committee. So there's this dispute that goes on, and eventually the workers are going to just walk out of Pullman Palace Cart Company because they don't find it advantageous to continue to work and pay high prices and high utilities, high rent. And so the workers actually joined the American Railway Union, and the leader is Eugene Debs. We're going to talk about him again. So he's going to be on our marker again on the standards. And the negotiations between George Pullman and Eugene Debs, they're going to fail. And the workers are just going to walk off their jobs. And the American Railway Union is going to stage this massive boycott of Pullman cars, and so for an entire month rail traffic comes to a halt in 27 states and in Chicago. And in response, George Pullman, instead of negotiating with Eugene Debs and these American Railway Union workers and his own workers, he closes up Pullman Company and locks his doors and locks his workers out rather than dealing with them. So he's being stubborn and hard-headed. And these railroad workers across the United States, they come and they go on strike from their jobs to also support the Pullman workers. And then other businesses have strikers strike. So this is this industrial unrest that this causes. And George Pullman also hires Alan Pinkerton, his detective agency, to come out and handle these violent rioters. And there's going to be some violence between them, gunshots and thrown objects and fires. And eventually, after a speech given by Eugene Debs in May of 1894, the strikers are going to go out and destroy railroad properties by setting it on fire. They burn over 600 freight cars, and the riots are going to end eventually with 30 people dead. 1894 Pullman strike is a good example of industrial unrest, because not only the George Pullman workers are going to strike, but also the American Railway Union workers are going to strike, and other unions strike, that they're upset about how they're being treated. And this is going to turn into a violent strike here between workers and management. It's going to end when the federal government sends out troops. President Grover Cleveland sends out troops to put the Pullman strike down. And George Pullman is real crafty with this. He hooked some United States mail carts up to the trains that are at Pullman there, because they put those Pullman cars on the railroad with all the other carts, and one had the U.S. mail in it. And when they burned all those cars, they burned one with U.S. mail in it. So Grover Cleveland made this a federal issue and sent an injunction through the court, because a U.S. mail cart had been destroyed in the fire. It became a federal issue. And so President Grover Cleveland called out the federal troops, and they put an end to the strike. Over 14,000 federal and state troops together, sent out by President Cleveland, put down the Pullman strike eventually. Here's a picture of the troops here lined up, some of them. George Pullman, 3 years later, he dies at the age of 66 in 1897 of a heart attack. And to pacify workers, President Grover Cleveland asked Congress to pass a Labor Day, National Labor Day. And so our Labor Day, the first Monday in September of each year, is Labor Day. We get that from President Grover Cleveland asking Congress to pass this in response to placate or pacify, calm down these workers and unions like that happened in the 1894 Pullman strike. So we learned three things from this strike. Okay, number one, we learned that the Pullman strike was an attempt by the workers who worked for Pullman to protect their wages. All they wanted to do was protect their money that they were making by working. Laborers or workers working, they wanted to protect their wages because his rents were too high, utilities were too high. It was like they were working for free. So all they wanted to do was protect their wages. They wanted to be fair. Alright. Second thing, Pullman strike was an example of industrial unrest and caused national industrial unrest. So that's another thing we learned from the Pullman strike. Thirdly, the Pullman strike demonstrated the federal government would actively intervene to crush strikes and protect the management, not the workers, but the management. So that's what we get from the Pullman strike. That's what we can learn from this event. So have we described the 1894 Pullman strike and as an example of industrial unrest? I think we have. And if you have any more questions, ask me in class. Send me an email. Good luck on the quiz, the test, and the EOCT.